G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 fantasy video. Today we're looking at my team selection and a season recap of 2024 ahead of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix this coming weekend. So as always guys, please do drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Right before we jump into how the season has gone thus far for my team and all things for Abu Dhabi, let's take a quick look back at how the team did in Lusail. 288 points and a pretty big weekend for many people running the 3X DRS boost chip. You can see here on the screen, it was what I activated on Lando Norris and George Russell. The plan was, since Coda, to plan for an Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris set up at this circuit, but a couple of DNFs, price changes, etc., put the team on the back foot. So ultimately went with a Norris-Russell combination. I honestly thought it was a good differential to have Russell in there after what we saw in free practice and sprint qualifying. And up until Saturday night, after qualifying there, I was quite confident Russell would be able to get the job done and end on a podium. But just as the fantasy gods had it, it was another stinker of a weekend. Lando looked set for a P2, and then obviously the penalties that were well documented throughout the weekend, pretty much an embarrassing display of race mismanagement from the FIA meant not just Lando, but George Russell, Lewis Hamilton were subject to various penalties, some probably more deserved than others, but it was just a very unfortunate outcome given that I thought heading into Sunday it was very well set up to do well and maybe claw back a bit of the points that those who used it at Coda had obviously exercised over the non-3X users up until this point in time. So 288 points certainly could have been a lot better. Looking at the two different options I had heading into the weekend, it was either going to be Lando Norris and George Russell or Oscar Piastri and Charles Leclerc. And with how things unfolded in that second stanza of the race, it was the Piastri-Leclerc combination that came out on top. So just another coin flip decision that didn't quite go my way. It's just been one of those nightmare seasons, and very much looking forward to seeing the end of this fantasy season. So yeah, currently sitting at just inside the top 15.8k, a shocking rank for me personally, well outside the goal I set myself at the start of the year. The team 2, on the other hand, not doing so bad, but it's this team 1 that we review week in, week out and test that performance against everyone else. So that's pretty much how things did in Qatar. I don't want to stew on it for too much more. I know there's talk around, obviously, Zhou doing well to get driver of the day, Max coming back after that unfair penalty on the Saturday, Gasly's 21 points, which I had in my team as well. We'll probably touch on those things just a little bit later, but happy to park this weekend for now. And there's quite a bit to get through in this video, so I do want to make sure we prioritize other segments as well. So for this segment, I'd usually have this as a standalone season review recap video, but thought I'd weave it into this one because I do think, first of all, many of you guys probably clock off as soon as the Grand Prix ends this coming Sunday for Abu Dhabi. And second of all, it does give me, I guess, a bit of a nice opportunity to review it within the wider team selection approach for this weekend. So I wanted to look at my season as a whole, kind of how things have turned out, how things have gone well and how things have not. And in terms of how my performance over the entire season has gone, I have been pretty confident up until probably the European leg of the calendar that I'd be able to kind of get inside the top 5k that I set myself at the start of the year. And things were looking pretty good up until Monaco. And then since that weekend, it was pretty much red arrows non-stop throughout the rest of the season. So we'll go through each of the weekends. I use different chipset, a couple of highlights, a couple of lowlights, and then we'll go on to the next slide where it's got a bit more of wider repercussions for all of you guys watching this. So for many of you that have followed me along here and on Twitter, used no negative in China. It was the first sprint race of the calendar, a track we hadn't raced at in many years, and there was a bit of rain that weekend too. So I thought, look, a perfect storm, pardon the pun, to use that chip there. And sure, it worked well. I had Valtteri Bottas, I believe, who DNF'd that race, so it saved me 20 points from that penalty attributed, and then used the Limitless in Miami. Now, a number of people used the Limitless in China because the top 5, top 6 drivers were pretty well clear-cut heading into that race, and I thought Miami's probably just a bit more of a safer circuit. So used it at Miami. got me inside the top 6K, which I was pleased about. Kind of on the right track to obviously that goal I set myself. But as we'll see in the next slide, the real winners of the limitless use were those that used it in China. Escaped Monaco without a DNF when K-Mag, Hulkenberg, Ocon all retired, as well as Perez. So a pretty disastrous weekend for people who owned those drivers, to escape with none at all at that track, and also bag Leclerc and Piastri in the top two who were in my team that weekend. Put the rank in a good position heading into Canada. And then Monza, I used the wild card, which was my next chip since Canada had quite a few races in between. I was kind of on a bit of a slide, as you can see here, after Austria, where things went pear-shaped really badly, in fact. And it pretty much just continued the whole way throughout the European leg of the calendar. So you can clearly see, in Monaco, a really good rank change, Canada a little drop, and then it just kind of went down and down and down until I activated the wild card in Monza. A brief reprieve of a couple thousand, and then back on the back foot in Baku. So it was, very much a mixed season. I do think there were 4 pivotal moments for my season in particular, which really set me back. So Austria, I had Lando Norris as my 2X, not Russell. And he obviously came to grips with Max Verstappen, ultimately retired in the final stages of the race. And with Red Bull as well as my second constructor with McLaren, I think I lost out on about 80 so points from Russell retiring, Verstappen dropping to P5, and having both of those constructors. So a pretty unfortunate result there. That was 18 points lost for a possible P2 for Lando, 18 positions lost for placement, finishing at the very back. So 36 points attributed to the constructor, and then Max lost out on 25 points or so for the possible win as well. So certainly more than 50 points I'm losing out on that weekend. Then you go to Belgium, I had Russell there, where he was disqualified after winning the race, so that was another 56 point swing if you take into account the positions gained from qualifying P8, the possible 25 points for the win. And then that also hit my Mercedes constructor as well. Baku, I had Sainz, where he clashed with Perez on the final laps. He went from P3 to out of the race, hit the Ferrari constructor that weekend as well, and then had Sainz again in Brazil. So kind of a double whammy there too. Bounced back a little bit in Qatar, climbed about 3,000 or so rank, but I think the damage was more or less done from, as soon as we hit the European leg of the calendar. Hopefully a bit more luck on my side by that point of the season next year, but it's very much a theme throughout that, going from 3K to, at the very worst, 18,000. It's not a pretty sight. If you guys have obviously had any of those similar instances or worse, let me know down in the comments below. In terms of pivotal moments as a whole for the F1 fantasy community, I alluded to the Miami and China limitless conundrum we had. You can see here on the screen those people that used no negative in China and limitless in the United States fetched about 700 points, let's call it. And if those people who used limitless in China probably weren't so inclined to use the no negative in Miami because of the dry racing conditions, a track we've been to before, came away with about 740 points. So although the delta is about 30 points, 40 points between the 2 weekends for the no negative users and or the China limitless users, you've also saved yourself a chip. So I do think you're coming out, 50 to 70 points net of the Miami limitless users if you deploy the no negative successfully at a track like Brazil, which was the other alternative. And I think if you were unfortunate to get hit with Ferrari, Colapinto, Albon, whatever it was in Brazil, you certainly saved yourself quite a headache with DNFs and rank swings. Another moment I think that really stood out, or 2 moments for the same driver, was Hulkenberg's disqualification and DNF in both Monaco and Brazil. I call that a shred of good fortune for me personally, but I didn't have him in either of those races. I moved off him, I think it was the race before Monaco, or it might have been 2 races before Monaco. So he obviously got hit with that disqualification, as did K-Mag in Monaco. And then again, the same for Hulk in Brazil. I know a couple of people in the community told me they had him in both of those weekends, So my condolences there. It was probably one of the few instances where I somehow came up against the bad luck, came out on the other side. And another moment, probably not quite as detrimental to points and ranks, was the final fix. Now, I think a few people wanted to be creative with it in Spa and take advantage of the Verstappen grid penalty there. He'd driven from the back into the points onto the podium for the race win in the past, a track with high overtakes. And people wanted to try and utilize the kind of high qualifying potential of the McLaren's final fix, a McLaren driver out and bring a Max Verstappen or something to that effect. It didn't quite work out, but it certainly didn't go as poorly as those who wanted to use it on Lando Norris in Azerbaijan. We saw him go out in Q1, started at the very back, and at a track like Baku, a street circuit known for its reputation of crashes, I thought Lando being in the meat grinder in the midfield probably was prone to a DNF or a collision with one of those other drivers like Lance Stroll, who we know loves to get into the wall and get into other drivers. So I took Lando out of my team, and instead of possibly not finishing the race, he came all the way from the back into the top four. He finished P4 as a result of Perez and Sainz crashing out. So not only did I have the Sainz DNF that weekend, but I also final fixed out Lando for Charles Leclerc, who had a pretty middling result on the Sunday in terms of fantasy with only 18 points. So probably one of the harsher weekends for me. And if you had the Baku weekend or the Spa weekend where the final fix flopped pretty hard, I'd be curious to hear that. Or if you used it more effectively on another weekend, do let me know, because there probably have been a few other instances this year where it has worked to greater effect. Now on to Abu Dhabi, Yas Marina circuit. How do we approach this weekend? I think with the last race on the calendar and many ranks at stake, bragging rights in mini leagues in play, there's probably a couple of different ways you could skin this cat. Now, I think if you're behind and you're looking to chase for the win or a particular position in the league, I'd say with a deficit of 15 to 20 points or more, then I think maybe 20 points or more, then I think it's worth considering going different. And what I mean by that is you could have, of your team of 7, let's say you're second, you're 20 points off first. Of your team of 7, you guys have probably got the same constructors and the same DRS boost, the same back markers. I think the real difference to try and chase that difference is going to be in your second premium driver or a low-owned midfield driver that you think has the potential to score well at this track. I'm looking at the likes of Gasly, Magnussen. Look, I'd say Hulkenberg. I'm sure he can't continue this bad run of form in the last race of the season, but I think you want to chase those low-owned midfield drivers and those low-owned second premiums, or you could alternatively throw your 2x on someone that may not be Lando Norris if that's where you think your rival will go. So I think that's where you can make up ground for 20 points. Obviously, that's the same amount as what a DNF would be, and owning one driver different to your rival would surely be enough to bridge that gap. But I do think going into the deadline, try and keeping the hope for a DNF to the back of your mind and going after those reliable midfield drivers and those kind of alternative premiums, the George Russells, the Carlos Sainzes. I'm not recommending Sergio Perez, but he's extremely low-owned and all he needs is one race. It's more than likely his very last race with Red Bull from what I'm reading. So, he might go out with a bang in a good or a bad way. But I do think you want to target those differential assets that your rival is most likely not going to own. I'd say one for every 15 to 20 points, you want to be targeting at least one different driver or one different asset. You could also go for a different constructor, but you also... I also think McLaren is probably the one you want to hold on to because they're going to be good at this track. Think about maybe going for Mercedes if he's got Ferrari or she's got Ferrari, or vice versa. And I guess to the contrary, if you're preserving a mini league position in first place, you want to play it safe and cover off your rivals. I think that depends on obviously your risk profile. Again, it's kind of very different to how if you were playing from behind. I think you probably want to play it safe to the point where you're not taking too many risks. But I think that depends on kind of how far you want to kind of play it forward. If we look at the global leagues, for example, last week in Qatar, the world number 2, Raheem, he went completely differential. He went Ferrari, Red Bull, because the world number 1, Andrew, was going McLaren, Mercedes, or something to that effect. So I think you do want to really think about where your rivals are, how far back they are, if you think they're going to take these kind of punts or they're going to settle for the position in the league. So I do think checking your rivals in your mini leagues, seeing what chips they've used, what team they have, and where they could potentially go for this weekend is probably the best way of covering off what assets they own versus what you have. In terms of the track itself, lots of runoff areas, one of the lowest risk tracks on the calendar. We only had one DNF here in 2022 and 0 here last year. So I do think there's, again, another reason to go for those low-end differentials that might be a little bit of risk. Your Magnussen's, Gasly's, Stroll even, I wouldn't necessarily recommend him, but again, not a driver many people are going to have at this point in the season. So I think it lends itself to going different and feeling confident that's not going to be an overly risky track to take that risk at. And that, I guess, also means because it's got such a high overtake rate, it's the only track in the last 2 years to be in the top 4 for overtakes. It was second 2 years ago with 79. It was the 4th most overtakes in 2023 with 113. So I do suspect it's going to be much the same. Again, midfield drivers or even drivers that might qualify a little bit out of position inside the top 10. I'm looking at the likes of Lewis Hamilton or maybe Carlos Sainz. They could be down in P7 to P9. If they have a bad qualifying, they might pick up a few overtakes and come into the top 3, top 4, a couple of positions gained. That might be the difference to bridge the gap of 10 or 15 points to a rival in your mini league. So think about that heading into the deadline this weekend. Now on, I guess, considerations for this particular deadline, I wouldn't say there's all that much different to how our team will be structured, to be completely honest. I've tweaked the power rankings just a little bit in the sense that the result in Qatar has some weight. And I do think more often than not, Lando Norris is going to be the better fantasy option, the more reliable fantasy option than, say, his teammate. But in terms of power rankings for Abu Dhabi, I have Piastri and Leclerc above him just because of the fact that I do think they are going to be great differential 2x options. 2 drivers I'm thinking about myself going for this weekend over Lando Norris, who I've had in my team more or less for the last few weeks. So I do think they are probably the pick of the bunch if you want to be different. If you want to play it safe, I think Norris is perfectly fine. Heading into the C tier category, a couple of drivers I want to quickly touch on. The first being Valtteri Bottas and Kevin Magnussen. This duo are both leaving the grid at the end of the year. Ordinarily, I wouldn't say they are the number one pick in the C tier asset class, but Bottas very fondly, I think, leaving a team that he's been with for 3 years now, and he may not be leaving the grid forever. There's speculation that Cadillac are potentially looking at him in 2026. But for now, it's very likely Bottas, he won't be on the grid ever again, if not at least for the next 12 months. So I think it's going to be a sad moment for the fans, a very sentimental moment for the fans. And that's why I think K-Mag and Bottas factor into the driver of the day vote. So in 2022, when Seb retired, he was awarded the driver of the day vote. As we know, it's 10 points, a valuable bonus in fantasy. And when Ricciardo left in Singapore, also received the driver of the day vote. It wasn't confirmed at the time, but I think there was, again, rumors that it was possible he wouldn't be racing again this season. So for that reason, I think Bottas is probably the more popular driver of the two to have this weekend. And sure, Magnussen, if he has a blinder, or even someone like Lewis Hamilton, if he wins the race, because they're moving or leaving, then I think that factors into that consideration. But I do think Bottas is probably the favourite and K-Mag probably the second favourite for driver of the day voting, as they won't be on the grid and likely not back in Formula One for the foreseeable, if at all. So that's kind of why I've got them at the top. The other driver I've got here on the list is Jack Doohan. Now, by this point, you guys are probably aware that Doohan will be racing in place of Esteban Ocon in the final race of the season. Ocon, as I understand it, will be testing with Haas, the post-Abu Dhabi testing they do at the end of every season. Ocon will not be an asset featuring in F1 Fantasy this weekend and will receive the penalties for a not classified driver in qualifying and the race. So if you own him, you have to make a trade. They won't be automatic switches if you own Esteban Ocon. As far as Jack Doohan is concerned, at the time of recording, there's no confirmation of what his price will be in the game. If it is a direct swap for Ocon, we've seen that with Behrman and Magnussen this year, is a one-for-one swap, same price. I probably wouldn't even remotely consider doing at Ocon's price. I think if he came in, somewhere between 5 and 7 million as a budget enabler, I think that's perfectly fine for one race, particularly given many of us are stretched at this time of the season. So if doing, I'll be posting about this on Twitter, so follow me over there if you haven't already. If he comes in at a competitive and affordable enabling price, I'll very much consider bringing him in just for one race, again, as a low-owned differential to try and get that edge over people close by me in the ranks. So I think, a wait and see for Jack Doohan for Abu Dhabi, but if you've got Ocon, get him out of your team. And then just quickly on team selection, it is, again, another kind of week where it's not going to be too exciting. I think in terms of changes, I've only got 2 transfers. If you've got 2 transfers, I think it'll be very much see if you can change that second premium or one of the midfield drivers. But that's kind of where my head's at right now in terms of, I think, where most people will go to for the extra DR or the 2x DRS boost. If you've got chips, get rid of them. I think if you've got Limitless, use that first. Then use 3x, no negative, and then whatever you've got left out of autopilot, funnel fix, or wildcard. If you've got wildcard, I would very much use that to kind of overhaul your team to the extent that you can get in a few lower owned assets to gain a bit more rank for this weekend. So think about that if you haven't yet used it. But I think in terms of my team, I'll just bring this up on the screen here so you can see where my head is at for the time being. Got my second team. You saw the rank for that earlier, but for my first team, as I've alluded to, I'll probably go down a different route to Lando Norris. I'm thinking Piastri, I could bring him in. That would leave me with, maybe Sainz. So theoretically speaking, if McLaren look good, I'll bring in Piastri, and if Ferrari's the second best team, bring in Sainz. I'll throw the 2x on Piastri. I think for me, if Ferrari look good and are looking to be the best team, I'll bring in Leclerc and Sainz. And then if Mercedes, for whatever reason, look good, I'll probably go for Lewis Hamilton. I could go for George Russell. He's been the best qualifier among all drivers since the summer break. But I do think Lewis race with Mercedes, yes, I know he had a stinker in Qatar. If it looks anything like he's going down that same path in free practice, I won't go near him, but I'm sure he wants to give it his all in his last race. So I could potentially go down, a Lewis Hamilton route. That would mean George Russell was already in my team for this weekend, from last weekend, I should say. And then, kind of where does that leave me with the second constructor? I'd maybe keep McLaren. I could go for Ferrari. I could go for Mercedes. I could go for something like that if I want to be very different. But there's a number of different routes I could go down for this weekend. All very much dependent on what the front running team is. I don't have enough to get to Max Verstappen, unfortunately, so that rules me out from entertaining him as a differential in Abu Dhabi. Keep in mind that Max has won the last 4 races and been on pole the last 4 times at this track, so he does become an extremely viable option heading into this weekend. But that's more or less the same approach for how I'll probably be tackling my team this weekend, chip strategy and team selection there. Just before I wrap things up, I want to do a quick kind of what's next for 2025 and a thank you to you guys. Again, I'd usually have this in my end of season recap video, but weaved that into this one to make it all one. In terms of the F1 fantasy game itself, a lot of positive and negative feedback in the community on Twitter, on Reddit, on YouTube, etc. around changes made to the game this season. The change to no negative, I think, was a very positive one to make it attributable to every scoring category and not just the overall score for the weekend. And I think more recently, the introduction of projected points in the live scoring functionality on the F1 Fantasy website itself is a great sign that they're taking on feedback. They're looking to factor in more updates to the game in the next year or so. But I do think there's still a bit of work to do, to be honest. We know how harsh the DNF penalties have been. It's ruined my season. It's ruined several others' seasons. And then also the driver of the day, I think maybe that has to come down to 5 points or be removed entirely. The fastest lap next year is obviously not being included in the World Drivers scoring, so I wonder if that is removed from the game as well. But I'll come back with all of my suggested changes and thoughts on what's next for the game in 2025 in January, February of next year. So stay tuned, subscribe to my YouTube channel to see all of those updates as they come through. just on the F1 Fantasy Community Survey, I've referenced this in the last 3 videos of mine. I will have it in the description below and in the comments to complete if you haven't done so already. This has been, let's call it rubber stamped by Formula One. They want to bring on this feedback, factor it into their end of season fantasy review so they can incorporate that into the gameplay for 2025. So if you have a very strong point of view on a scoring metric, on a chip, on the user interface, whatever it might be, complete the survey. We'll collate the data points and we'll share that with Formula One at the end of the year when we connect with them. So please do let me know if you have issues with the survey. We'll happily get that rectified as soon as possible so we can include your feedback. And just on the channel specifically, new graphics, new segments. I've been working on these for the last 3-4 months. Looks really good. I'm really happy with how things are. So you'll get a completely new channel interface from 2025. I've taken on feedback from you guys. I've looked at other content creators in other fantasy sports for the last kind of 6 months or so to gather what I think can be the best fantasy product on YouTube. So very excited to roll those out in the new year. It's going to be a completely different change to what you're seeing. There'll be no more red, no more gray overlays that you're seeing on screen at the moment. A lot more kind of softer colors and better graphics to obviously help guide your decisions and make the viewing process much smoother as well. And last but obviously not least, I want to thank each and every one of you for engaging with me on Twitter, on YouTube, this season. It's been far and away the best fantasy season. Maybe not for me in terms of my rank, but certainly in terms of engagement, in terms of decisions and strategy. It's been the most open, the most diverse in terms of team selection decisions every single week. And without you guys, obviously wouldn't be coming back and doing this every single week. I love doing it. I love engaging with you guys, and I'll be back for more in 2025. So I want to thank each and every one of you for your contributions to the community. It's people like you that make this community so enjoyable and so great. But yeah, that's going to be it for now, guys. A video that's just over 25 minutes, a bit longer than what I'd usually like it to be, but did want to get everything into this one video. I'll be back with the fantasy formula for the last deadline stream of the season over on FanAmp's YouTube channel this Saturday. So drop by for that if you want to say hi. But in the meantime, guys, again, thank you for an incredible season. It's been the best one yet, and I will see you all in 2025.